Good morning. I'm really excited to be with you all here today to share a foundational model that's really informed my work with young people over the last 10 years. My name is Jenny Briggs. My pronouns are she and her, and I serve as program director for AMPLIFY Youth Health Collective in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Before we get started, I do just want to give a little context for the work that we do so that you can kind of understand why I'm here talking about this with you today. So AMPLIFY is a capacity building organization. So we support direct service partners, school districts, parents, and ultimately young people to promote adolescent sexual health and well-being. The orientation that we bring to this work is that we believe in the power of young people, as well as their right to self-determination and critical information about their bodies and relationships. So research tells us, right, that when youth have access to accurate, comprehensive information, environments that support and advocate for their growth and share power with them, and access to invaluable clinical and social services, that they make the healthiest decisions possible for themselves, right? They're the ones who prevent unplanned or mistimed teen pregnancy. They're the ones who prevent adolescent STI transmission. And they're the ones who set healthy boundaries in romantic and peer relationships and navigate issues of consent. But I'm really excited to see all of these folks here with us today, because it's on us, right, as adults to provide and advocate for the basic tools that they need to do that work. And our goal is to build and improve and maintain a system in which every young person has access to the resources they need to make healthy choices now and as an adult, right? Before I get started as well, I do want to highlight that we're going to be talking about multiple dimensions related to sexuality, sexual experiences, and sexual health. I'm not going to ask for any sort of like personal disclosure or personal information from you all, but this content itself can feel deeply personal, right? It's rooted in our personal value systems. So I would be surprised if at some point during our talk today, you didn't experience some sort of a reaction to some of the content, right? And I would encourage you to pay attention to what sparks insight for you, right? What makes you feel uncomfortable? What elicits strong emotions? Because there's some learning there that can really help us to be better professionals in working with young people, right? There will be a portion of the presentation that deals broadly with experiences of sexual violence. And so I encourage you all to take care of yourselves in the best way that you know how. If you need to turn your camera off or step away for a moment, please feel free to do that. So we're going to jump right in, and I'm going to need your input on this part. We're going to do a little definition or word association. I want to hear from you all. When you hear the term sexuality, what do you think of? So what is sexuality? You can drop it in the chat, you can unmute, but what are some things that come to mind for you when you hear that term or that word? How intimacy is shared or expressed? Good. What else? A difficult topic to talk about with you. This is something we may feel uncomfortable. Preference to a partner, so maybe who we're attracted to, whether that's sexually, romantically, emotionally. Identity, so who we are. Fear, so maybe some emotions might come up for us when we hear the term shame. Shame, so some of those empowerment. Reproductive drives and processes, the physical act of sharing intimacy, identity, both sexual and related to gender. Yeah. Well, keep the thoughts coming. You're all correct, right? All of those pieces apply. And today we're going to focus specifically on the holistic, all-encompassing nature of human sexuality. So there's a term here called Holistic Sexuality that's really going to help us along in our talk today. Holistic sexuality includes the entire person, right? Not just one piece. Our sexuality includes how we think and feel about our bodies and who we're attracted to, who we are, right? That foundational concept of self-identity, as well as our sexual or reproductive anatomy. So it's really broad. Ultimately, this session is about broadening our scope of understanding when it comes to sexuality. The model we're going to dive into today kind of lays a foundation for understanding sexuality as an inherent part of being human, right? It's something that doesn't start with puberty, doesn't start and end with sexual behavior, right? It impacts our lives from the time we're a little bitty infant until the time that we die. And this is really powerful, right? Because it can normalize and promote conversations about sexual health and help us to understand that every single professional or personal relationship we have with young people is an opportunity to assist them in navigating and appreciating their sexuality, which is part of their humanness. It can also really help us to understand all of the different sources of learning that we've engaged in related to sexuality over the course of our lives, right? So by the end of today, or the end of our hour together, I'm going to hope that you all can identify the 6 circles of holistic sexuality, that you'll be able to kind of understand sexuality as a highly individualized, lifelong experience that's different for everybody and encompasses a lot more than just sexual behavior. And that you'll be able to think about at least 3 different ways that the model we're going to look at can be applied to understanding sexual experiences, particularly for young people. So we'll have kind of a youth lens as we go through it together. We will have time for Q&A at the end, hopefully, but I don't want that to stop you from kind of engaging with me in the chat or even interrupting me. If you have a question, feel free to unmute. I know there's a lot of us, but I'd like this to be as conversational as possible. So what you see on your screen are called the circles of sexuality. The circles, originally developed by Dr. Dennis Daly, is one model for understanding holistic sexuality as a critical part of the human experience. See, this is from Our Whole Lives. Yes, they definitely use that as foundational in that curriculum. I'm glad you're already making connections. There are lots of other really fantastic models, which I can provide for you all as resources if you're interested. But today we're going to focus on this. A little bit of time in each circle, I'll offer a brief explanation of what it is and may ask you all some questions along the way. Again, please feel free to type in the chat or unmute yourselves. I want this to be as interactive as it can be. And then we'll spend some time applying the circles directly to the youth experience. So thinking about, what are some inherently teenage experiences that might fall into this circle, or what are some questions that young people might have about the circle. So let's start with sensuality. Sensuality is the awareness of and feelings about our own bodies and the bodies of other people, both mental and physical, right? It's not just a physical experience, although that is part of it. Sensuality allows us to feel good about how our bodies look and feel and what they can do, and allows us to enjoy what our bodies can give us and give to other people. This part of sexuality has to do with the 5 senses, so anything associated with sight, touch, smell, taste, hearing, as well as our perceptions of those experiences, right? Humans are meaning makers, and so it's not just enough to have the sensory experience, but kind of what does that mean for us? So let's talk about a couple examples. Body image, right? Is that feeling attractive and proud of one's own body and the way it functions or influences many aspects of our life. Adolescents can often choose media personalities as the standard for how they should look. I would argue that this is the experience of a lot of adults as well, right? And so there can be a feeling of disappointment when what they see in the mirror doesn't kind of match up to what they've seen in mainstream media, social media, that kind of thing. Sensuality also involves experiencing pleasure. So it allows a person to experience pleasure when certain parts of the body are touched. People also experience sensual pleasure from taste or touch or sight or hearing or smell as a part of being alive, right? So when I walk out of my house in the morning and I smell the fresh cut grass in my neighborhood, when I feel invigorated by that, that's a sensual experience. And then satisfying skin hunger. I'm going to ask you all to just give me an emoji reaction if you've ever heard the term skin hunger before. You can pick whatever emoji you like best. Have you heard this term before? A couple folks. Yeah. Skin hunger is really about our biological need as human beings to be touched. And I think thinking about babies in particular is a really powerful way to talk about skin hunger. Does anybody know what happens to an infant if they aren't held often? What happens? You can unmute your
disorder.
Say it again, one more time.
Reactive attachment disorder.
So they may not, they may develop some psychological or ability, like stuff later on down the line. Yeah, so there's like a mental health component to that. Failure to thrive, right? There's even a physical component to it. They won't actually grow if they're not touched often enough. Good. Do we know about any changes in the ways that adolescents are touched when they kind of hit puberty? Thinking about the adults in their lives, maybe. So young people are actually going to be touched a lot less often and may experience touch deprivation compared to younger children. And so they're going to satisfy that skin hunger, right? And we see that kind of show up in classrooms sometimes. If you've ever walked into a middle school classroom where folks are just roughhousing, right? Maybe pulling on each other's backpacks, there's a lot of physical touch happening. And then sexual intercourse itself can result from someone's need to be held rather than from sexual desire. Much less touch from adults. Preschool teachers might hug their students, but high school teachers usually don't. Yeah, good. And so then feelings of attraction kind of also occur in this circle. Fun fact, the center of sensuality and attraction to other people doesn't actually occur in the genitals, right? Despite all the jokes that we may hear about that. The center of sensuality and attraction to others is in our brains, which is arguably the human's most important sex organ. And then finally, we have fantasy. Well, actually not finally. Next, we have fantasy, which is the brain also gives people the capacity to have fantasies about sexual behaviors and experiences. So teens often need help understanding that sexual fantasy is normal and that one does not have to act upon sexual fantasies, right? So it doesn't mean you necessarily have to engage in a physical act, even though you're thinking about something or fantasizing about something. And then we finally have the human sexual response cycle, which is going to be the sequence of physical and psychological responses that people go through during sexual arousal and activity. And so I want to hear from you all a little bit. What teen-specific experiences or questions do you think might come up for young people related to sensuality? We've talked a little bit about body image. So the question of what's normal. Is my body normal? Is what I like normal? Yeah. That feeling of motivation by likes on social media. Good. Why do I feel this way? Right? What's the meaning behind it? Good. So next we have intimacy. And I noticed intimacy came up quite a bit when we were doing our initial brainstorm. Sharing intimacy is what makes personal relationships rich. And so while sensuality is about physical closeness, intimacy is going to be about emotional closeness for our purposes of kind of defining the circles today. Caring about others means feeling their joy and their pain. It means being open to emotions that may not be comfortable or convenient. But we do know that intimate relationships are not possible unless there isn't an emotional investment, right? Unless we care. Liking or loving is all about having an emotional attachment or connection to other people. And then emotional risk taking, right, is huge here. So to have true intimacy with others, a person is going to have to open up and share feelings and personal information, right, which is inherently risky because the other person may not feel the same way, even though it's not possible to really be close to somebody else without being honest or open with them. And then all of those things kind of tie in together to define vulnerability. Right? So when we share with other people, when we care about them, when we love them, and when we're taking emotional risks with them, that makes us vulnerable. The other person is going to have some power to hurt us emotionally. So intimacy requires vulnerability on the part of each person in a relationship. In essence, right, this circle is about the ability and the need to be emotionally close to another human being and to accept that emotional closeness in return. It's all about how we relate to other people in non-romantic and romantic relationships, in sexual and non-sexual relationships. And so my question for you all to kind of kick us off is, how do we learn how to be intimate with other people? How do we learn how to experience emotional vulnerability, emotional risk-taking? From our caregivers? Modeling from caregivers. Yeah. The media, attachment figures, so people who we've cared about as a young child, life experiences, movies. Yeah. Yeah. Young children and teens watch and learn based on how intimacy is modeled in their home and in the outside world, which is exactly what you all are saying, right? So how do the people in their home take care of each other? How is sharing done? How is conflict handled? The good news is, right, that intimacy often involves communication and skills that can be explicitly taught, right? So how we engage in intimacy is heavily informed by our families of origin, our culture, our learned patterns of behavior, how the systems we exist in operate, any trauma we may have experienced. It's really nuanced. But that doesn't mean that folks can't unlearn and relearn if there is some chance for developing some healthier skills. So yeah. And then Bridget shares there's a lack of intimacy in porn and social media in general. And I love that you're highlighting that, right? Because sometimes one of the first sort of depictions or times a young person is engaging or trying to learn about sexual behavior might be through pornography, right? And if they don't have a place to process that effectively and to hear that messaging of this isn't necessarily what this looks like, right? Let's talk about that together. They may believe that that is sort of like what sex is, right? When we know that there's lots of different ways that that can happen. Good. So you kind of already gave me an example, right, of how that might show up for young people. What are some other ways that intimacy might show up in teen relationships, whether they're romantic or not? Yeah. Or what questions might they have? I think teens experience intimacy through talking during late nights about their suicidality. Is that suicidality? Yeah. So sharing secrets, right, can be really big. Bonding over some of those big things. Will I be hurt? Yeah. How do I protect myself? I also think too, intimacy can show up in the renegotiating of relationships with their caregivers as they gain more independence, right? So they're having to figure out like, how do I share, and what parts do I share with my parents that maybe I didn't before? Could be seen as a weakness. Talking via virtual methods, right? Sometimes text, social media, Reddit. Good. Y'all are brilliant. Sadly, many of my clients believe intimacy is the same thing as sexual intercourse. Yeah, and so this can be a really helpful tool sometimes to help people kind of tease out that those things overlap and are going to be related, which we'll talk about in just a minute, but that there are different pieces at play in each part. So let's talk a little bit about sexual identity. Sexual identity is a person's understanding of who they are sexually, including a person's sense of their gender. I also just want to like reinforce our sexual identity is inseparable from our self-identity, right? This isn't just like some compartmentalized piece of who we are. This is about who we are. It gets at the very sense of who somebody is and perceives themselves to be. And that can kind of be broken down into a couple of different components. And I will also say this list is not exhaustive. The language around this is changing all of the time. So sex assigned at birth is a label, usually male or female, assigned to someone at birth. Our biological sex involves a combination of anatomy, hormones, and chromosomes, right? But doctors usually give a baby their label based solely on what their genitals look like, which isn't always an indication as much as it is an assumption sometimes. So for a long time, we thought sex involved just male and female. And now we know that about 1 in 100 people have bodies who differ from what we think of as standard male or standard female bodies. And so you may hear the term intersex to describe bodies that kind of fall outside of that binary. And then we have gender identity, right, which is separate from sex assigned at birth. And that's really somebody's innermost concept of themselves as male, female, a blend of both, neither, and how they perceive themselves and what they call themselves. So somebody's gender identity can be the same, or it can be different from their sex assigned at birth. And then gender roles are going to be those social roles that encompass a range of behaviors and attitudes that are generally considered acceptable, appropriate, or desirable for somebody based on that person's sex assigned at birth or their perceived sex. So in lots of instances, our social identity involves how closely, if at all, we do or don't align with those social roles, right, that are associated with our perceived sex or our gender identity. And then finally, we have orientation. So sexual orientation or romantic orientation is an inherent and enduring emotional, romantic, or sexual attraction to other people. This is actually a really, really big one for young people. So how do you all think that teens might experience the circle of sexual identity, or what questions might come up with them? Yeah, so Bridget shares, I also wonder how race affects gender roles as well, if at all. And I would just say that gender roles are very cultural, right? So our expectations in, even looking at the United States, in Oklahoma may be very different than what they might be in another part of the country. And so it is something that's very much like constructed within our community and varies across intersections and like locations. Yeah. So exploring who they are and who they're attracted to. Yeah. Figuring out who they are is like a huge developmental task of adolescence, right? So there's going to be lots of questions and lots of things that young people are thinking about related to this.
I feel like this is also like a highly anxious topic for a lot of teens because they're exploring and they're trying things out, and that's anxiety provoking, you know, to be seen as, oh, I'm actually going to change my pronouns, and finding a safe place to experiment with that versus, you know, having to tell your parents who they're feeling afraid to. And yeah, this is, I work with a lot of teens who have sexual identity exploration going on, and there's a lot of anxiety.
Yeah. Yeah, which just kind of highlights, right, that like that exploration is also tied to self-disclosure, right? Emotional risk-taking, and for some young people, even physical risk-taking, right? If they don't know if they're going to be able to be accepted by the family that they're living with, or remain living with the family that they're living with. Thank you for holding that up. Yeah. Respecting pronouns is huge for teens in my experience. Yeah. And kind of acknowledging really intense friendship before realizing that maybe you're attracted to this, maybe you're attracted romantically or sexually to the same kinds of people you've developed really intense emotional bonds with. Good.
I'll just say too, also teens, you know, they go from that everything is black and white to there's a hazy gray area, right? Developmental. Right. They also move to being heavily influenced by their family, to being heavily influenced by their peers and the society around them as a whole. So culture plays a huge part, I think.
Thank you. Yeah.
I also was thinking about how for some teens and for some families, not everything, not every choice is acceptable. So that's a lot of, you know, a lot to consider for them, and anxiety provoking probably.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay. So next we have sexual health and reproduction, right? So this is the circle that a lot of people think of most when they hear the term sexual education, sexual health education, right? Because it involves factual information about reproduction, right? Young people, it is critical that young people have information about how their bodies work, how conception happens, how STI infections occur. And often they have inadequate information, right, about their own or their partner's bodies. And nobody can make an informed decision about sexual expression or about how to protect our health unless we have access to that information, right? We all need to understand anatomy and physiology because everybody needs to understand and appreciate the ways in which their bodies function. And so there's that facts and information piece. But then there's also this feelings and attitude piece. And we know that feelings and attitudes are wide ranging when it comes to sexual expression and reproduction and sexual health related topics, right? Like STIs, HIV, contraceptive use, abortion, pregnancy, childbirth, all of those things are going to be heavily influenced by personal values. Good. And then sexual intercourse itself, right, is one of the most common behaviors among human beings. So sexual intercourse is a behavior that can produce pleasure. It can also result in pregnancy or STIs. And that's where it goes back to that information piece, those facts and information piece. It's also going to involve reproductive and sexual anatomy. So the body and the ways in which it functions, right? As a part of sexual health. It'll also include, when we're thinking about kind of the broader lifespan, information about menopause, infertility, those kinds of things as well. So what are your thoughts here? This is the one that really has to do with sexual behavior itself, right? So actual sexual behaviors. What are some teen-specific life experiences that might fall in here, or what questions might come up?
I just wanted to share, Jenny, that I had a few friends back home who part of their work was leading these types of workshops for teens, and the amount of misconceptions and lack of knowledge among adolescents regarding what we might consider maybe the most basic stuff regarding these issues was just, sometimes it was really amazing.
Yeah.
I think we need to always keep that in mind. We think they know everything, they usually don't.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. Bridget kind of highlighted that too in the chat a little bit. So young people may pretend that they know, act like they don't want to know, but they do want to know, right? Yeah, so Preston added heteronormativity and reproduction. If you feel comfortable, Preston, I don't want to put you on the spot, but would you mind sharing a little bit more about that thought?
Yeah, so I was just reading the question where it says, how might teens experience sexual health and reproduction? And I go back to even just when I was in high school and I did that family and whatever, it was like the facts class. And we didn't have a single discussion outside of a male and female family unit. And the whole purpose of the class was to prepare us to create this baby with our opposite sex partner and create this family so it could contribute to society. And so I think a lot of the messages in society are just telling young people that there is this heteronormative household. This is what you can do to be a part of society and move us forward. And they don't even go into family planning ways outside of that or show other options.
Thank you. Thank you. You know, I think a lot of time we talk about how, is our sex ed curriculum meeting the needs of LGBTQ young people in a way that allows them to protect themselves from an unplanned pregnancy or STI? And I love the flip side of that, right? Are we talking about representative families? Do young people see that as an option for themselves if that's something that they want later on in life? And are we giving them the tools and information to make space for that? Yeah. Somebody shared also that my teens don't believe that they can get pregnant or STIs on the first time, or they often want to be pregnant. Yeah, and some young people may want to parent at this time in their life. Helping youth identify what is appropriate versus inappropriate and legal versus illegal. Yeah, so it can be really huge helping them walk through right or wrong, right? This is the landscape of the law, and here are the potential things that could happen if XYZ were to occur. Yeah. Thank you for all of the great insight now. We have just a couple of more. So many teens send photos of themselves, which is illegal and considered distribution of child pornography. Yeah, that can be huge, right? It can be huge, and can also kind of go back to that intimacy piece, right? That is the person I'm sharing this with somebody that I trust not to send this image to other people without my consent. Yeah. And then Abby shares what some young women believe is their responsibility or obligation. So things like taking care of the sexual needs of males, right? Which is a really big cultural message. Really big cultural message. It's big stuff they're dealing with, right? Yeah. And so then this next circle we call sexual power over others. And really what this is about is using sexuality to manipulate or control other people. This circle can span behaviors that range from relatively harmless to things we consider violent, cruel, and criminal. So things from flirting, seduction, to harassment, assault, abuse, coercion. It's not listed on here, but I also think about like trafficking, right, which has a big issue for young people in Oklahoma. And then this is also where those advertising media messages show up. I think really this ties in too with your comment, Abby, about some of the cultural messages, right, as well. So how do you think that teens might experience either sexual power over other people or other people exerting sexual power over them? What questions might come up in this area for them? This is where an unaffirming family can cause the most damage. So thinking about reparative therapy. Thank you. Yeah. I also think about kind of the pressure to send naked images or explicit images. Saw that a lot in my work, even with middle schoolers. Receiving unwanted images from other people. Social media. Yeah. Gender norms play a huge role here. Yeah. Brittany shares, I think, of exposing culture. So those sharing texts or pictures, peer pressure in general, right? I think someone kind of held up how peer relationships are so important in this kind of like age and stage. And so the pressure there can be huge. And so then finally, overlaying all of these dimensions is like one last circle, which represents an individual's values, agency, and power, right? So values can represent our own personal and familial values that may impact how each component of sexuality plays out in our lives and relationships. Power here can come from a sense of self-worth and understanding of one's preferences and values, which enable someone to realize sexual well-being and health. And then agency involves our capacity to influence, consent, negotiate, decline, and decide about all of the factors within all of the circles, right? So any ideas about how young people might experience agency different than their adult counterparts? I guess I could phrase it like this. Do you think that young people have more control over all of these pieces in their life, or less control than adults might have related to their sexuality or their sexual health? Less control? More? So Bridget says more, Sonia says less. Yeah, and it might kind of ebb and flow a little bit. But in general, yeah, in many areas, less control. Jimmy says it depends. So less knowledge, more control. Yeah. That's a lot, right? I'm going to add just a little bit more, and I just want to highlight that each of these circles kind of overlap, right? None can be separated from the other because they are all going to impact each other, and they're all going to impact kind of who we are and how we relate to other people. So we're going to do an activity together where we're going to highlight this for just a little bit. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read a really, really brief scenario, and I'm going to launch a poll for you. And I want you to vote. I want you to decide which circle do you think the statement most applies to, or the scenario most applies to. And then I want you to kind of prepare mentally to state your case, because I'm going to ask some folks kind of like, okay, share with me why you chose this or why you chose that. But before we do that, I also just want to hold up Katrina's comment that says, I think young people probably perceive having less control just because so many other things in their lives are controlled or directed by adults. Yeah, so they may have more power than they even know that they have. I like that frame. Okay, good. So let's start with some scenarios. This first one, negotiating condom use with a partner. What circle do you think that falls in? sensuality, intimacy, sexual identity. Oh, I need to actually launch the poll. There we go. Negotiating condom use with a partner. Oh, yes, Bridget, I'm so sorry. You do have to choose one. You have to choose the one you think applies the most, and then we'll talk it out. I would have chosen a few. Okay. Okay, let's take maybe 5 more seconds. Get your votes in. All right. So here are our results. It looks like most folks chose sexual health and reproduction, right? Which is kind of that group, that category that has all of those facts and information, actual sexual behavior, those kinds of pieces. If you didn't choose sexual health and reproduction and you're willing to unmute and tell us what you chose and why, I would love to hear from you. Or if you would have chosen more than one, I would love to hear from you as well.
I would have also chosen intimacy because it can affect, like that decision-making process can affect the intimacy and the closeness that each are feeling. It also has to do with people's values. Maybe a woman really doesn't want to get pregnant at a certain time or at all, you know, and so it has to do with values and sexual power over others. And, you know, maybe the male really wants to have a child and the woman is trying to have power over that by not wanting to reproduce, and it's, yeah, complicated.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. Yeah, personal values are huge when it comes to this stuff. Okay. All right.
I would
Another one. Oh, go ahead.
I thought it was also kind of related to the issue of power over others. So, or sexual power, I think it was phrased. So, you know, for a woman to talk about that, or for a girl to talk about that with a boy, or anyone really who in a relationship has less power, it's also a power issue. Am I able to talk about what I'm feeling, what I'm wanting? So power also comes into play, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, huge. Thank you. Okay, any other thoughts before we do one more, a couple more? Continue. All right, so a young person in your life approaches you to find out where they can get an STI test. They tell you their partner recently tested positive for an STI and they need to know where to get tested. What circle applies the most? Like 5 more seconds. Okay. So vast majority are coming in with sexual health and reproduction. Got 1 vote for intimacy and 4 for values, agency, and power. So definitely we understand how like an STI test or getting treatment might apply to sexual health and reproduction. How might it apply to issues of intimacy? Or how might this scenario apply to issues of intimacy?
Jenny, this is Brittany. I don't know if you can hear me. I don't know. I kind of, my initial thought was number 4, sexual health and reproduction, but then I just kind of thought how vulnerable a young person might feel to kind of share that information with someone. So I wanted to kind of pick the second top choice for myself. So just that part, because that has to be really kind of scary and might cause a lot of anxiety for them.
Yeah, I mean, both on the side of coming to you, right? So it says a lot about their willing to disclose or take an emotional risk with you, but then also, you know, was this a monogamous relationship? Was this something that they weren't expecting, right? Confused. All right, let's do one more. A young person in your life discloses to you that they're trans. They want to begin styling their hair and dressing in a way that feels more comfortable for them, but are very concerned about their parents asking questions or finding out about their identity. Okay, take like 5 more seconds. Okay. So lots of votes for sexual identity, and then quite a few also for values, agency, and power. Does anybody that chose values, agency, and power want to unmute and share with us why you chose what you chose? See your question, Katrina. I'm going to come back to it.
I feel like I've been speaking up a lot, that's why I paused. I chose values, agency, and power because it was quite obvious to me that it's about identity, but I wanted to remember for myself and reinforce that when someone is exploring their identity, they're exploring their values, and by changing, you know, like exploring their gender expression, that's their agency and their power to, you know, control how people see them and perceive them, and that's a strengths-based approach.
Thanks, Bridget.
I will just say, for this one, I wish there was a whole different category called courage. For sure.
Yeah. Well, and I think you could, I love that you're holding that up. I think you could make the case for intimacy, right? When it comes to that emotional risk taking in a way. Yeah, courage. So Katrina asked a really great question that I want to make sure we come back to, and asked, why is gender identity included in sexual identity when they're very different things? So gender identity is a component, right? It's one piece within that circle. It also includes, that circle itself is also going to include things about our biology, right? So which goes back to that sex assigned at birth and kind of the labels that come from that. It's also going to include things about sexual orientation, right? So who are we attracted to? Who am I, and who am I attracted to? So it's a broader circle than just what we might initially think of when we hear the term sexual identity. It's going to kind of break down into those pieces. I have a really great resource that I can make sure to send out to the Haruv team with our slides, called the Gender Unicorn, which kind of breaks this down a little bit farther. So you can kind of see how all of the different components come into like one holistic sense of self. Did that answer your question? Perfect, thank you. Yeah. Number shared, I also think that the ability to explore gender identity and sexual orientation is also a privilege. So maybe related to safety in a way, like, is my environment safe enough for me to explore and think about these things? Or were you kind of thinking that from even a different lens than that?
Yeah, that applies. I was also thinking of it in relation to race. Our agency's been talking a lot about race this year, so it's really, really on my mind. And I'm just thinking about how some people may not have the privilege to the ability to go there in themselves, because they're walking around just afraid already. You know, it's already like safety is just such a big issue, and to then expose yourself as being variant even further, yeah, I just see that as like a risk people might not be willing to take.
Yeah, thanks for holding that up. Well, you all have sufficiently nailed it. The one last thing I want to add before I kind of open it up to debrief and additional questions is that, you know, as human beings, and, you know, if you come from a social work background, this is going to make total sense to you, but we don't live in a vacuum, right? We're all people within an environment. And within that environment, you know, swirling around these circles are going to be the attitudes, values, and beliefs that are held by individuals and systems within our communities that we interact with daily, right? Religion, culture, our family system, the legal system, our place of work, the scientific values and political climate of the time that we're living in. And so each of these also have the power to influence how we think about ourselves, different aspects of our sexuality, and how we interact with other people. And so that is it. Those are all the things that we came to talk to you about today. And I'd love to hear if you have any questions. I'd also love to hear if you have any like initial reactions or kind of aha moments, anything that was new to you or kind of reinforced something you already knew. I'd love to hear about any of that.
Hi, my name is Jimmy. And so I work with adolescents typically in mental health, but also work in the field of child abuse and neglect. One term that I hear being used to describe LGBTQ plus youth, and this is intended to be more inclusive, is SOGI. So for sexual orientation, identity, and gender expression. A term I've used in the past was sexual minority when I present on gay youth, but some people find that term less attractive, for lack of a better word. But SOGI seems to be more inclusive. Kind of what are your experiences have been in terms of terminology to help be inclusive with youth? Yeah,
so I love that. And I love that you've highlighted SOGI, because that was like an acronym I learned for the first time a couple of weeks ago. And I think that it goes back to the fact that language around sexual identity is constantly changing. Right. And I've worked with some folks who feel this pressure that they're going to say the wrong thing or they're going to mess something up. And so in our practice, you know, I think the more gender neutral language that we can use in engaging with young people, so referring to romantic or sexual partners as partners and not making the assumption that somebody is dating someone with a specific identity. I think when we talk about bodies, you know, talking about them in terms of body parts as opposed to here's what a female body looks like or here's what a female body does, right? We might say something like, you know, people with uteruses or people with vulvas, those kinds of things. And then one of the most powerful insights that a mentor ever gave to me in working directly with young people is that when they tell you who they are, believe them, right? And ask them what that means for them, right? So if we don't understand a term right away, that's okay, right? Young people are the experts on their own identity, and they're going to be able, if they're coming to us to share with us about who they are, they're going to be able to tell us what's important for them in sharing that label. And so, and I'd love to hear if the rest of the group has any other insights or ideas on that too, because I know we've got a great group of professionals here, but did that answer the question?
Yes, and thank you for that.